So this is part 2 of my video on cyclones, psychology and storytelling. And in this video, I'll explain how social inequalities pull us apart during and after extreme weather events and how psychology can often make that worse. So I ended the last video getting to that topic of social inequalities and mentioned the flood event here in Townsville. The flood happened in February 2019 when we had a monsoon trough that sat over the region for days on end, dumping so much rain on the city that the main dam reached capacity and they had to open the floodgates to avoid a catastrophe. They avoided catastrophe, but it still ended up causing over 1,000 homes to be flooded and thousands of residents had to be evacuated, and there was a massive load of damage to the infrastructure of the city. When the flood waters receded, it became more and more clear that we weren't all in it together, because the flood had brought to the surface pre-existing social inequalities that had been sitting there for years. I saw that most raw at an evacuation centre. I was one of those who had to be evacuated. It all happened at a very short notice and we had to leave pretty quickly. When I got to the centre, it was already fairly full. It was a rough night. Didn't get much sleep, but we were all safe. So that was a good thing. The next day, I got a proper sense of who was there. And there were people from a big cross-section of the community. But as the day went on, people started packing up their stuff and leaving the centre. But not uniformly. It was really mostly the white middle-class folk who were heading off. They had found somewhere else to stay. It was the working-class folk, people from the poorer sections of the community, who were left behind. They had nowhere else to go. And this was happening for a number of reasons. First, more poor people than middle-class people live in flood zones, and because housing in flood zones is cheaper. And because poverty is structural and generational, you tend to find poor people's families and friends are also living in those areas. So they had fewer people they could turn to. The people they knew were already there in the evacuation centre with them. Also, poor people couldn't afford to book themselves into a hotel for the night. They were less likely to have their own transportation, and they were stuck. They were stuck in the evacuation centre. Now, I left the evacuation centre later that day because, well, I'm middle class. I have transport and I had connections to people who lived outside the flood zones. In my case, it was my boss at work who arranged a bed for me at a friend's house, and I was very grateful for that. But that's because I'm middle class and I'm more mobile than, a lot of people. Now, we know from a growing body of research that extreme weather events disproportionately hit the poor. A cyclone will bash a posh person's house as much as it will bash a poor person's house, but the posh person is likely to live in a more modern, solidly built house, less likely to be living in a flood zone, is more likely to be able to afford insurance, is more likely to live in an area that's served by more stable, better protected infrastructure. Also, poor people have less income to help them prepare for these extreme events, are less protected against the economic shocks that come after such events, and they recover at a much slower rate than more affluent people. So we know that severe weather events not only reveal social inequalities, they actually exacerbate them. And because of this, these big weather events don't really so much bring people together. There's this tendency that it pulls them apart because of these social inequalities. And Townsville has very affluent areas that sit right next to very poor areas. You can see this in data from the Index of Relative Socioeconomic Advantage and Disadvantage. The index works on a 10-point scale, with a value of 1 being the level of greatest disadvantage and 10 the level of highest advantage. In Townsville, we have suburb of Heatley, which is 1 on the scale, that sits 1 neighbourhood away from Douglas, which is 9 on the scale. And here we get to the final thing. This is where psychology comes in to make the whole thing worse. just as we struggle to unite people with our common stories, as we are split apart through inequalities, psychology throws in a construct into our storytelling that further pulls us apart. And that construct is resilience.
Brave acts of bravery from frontline workers and local heroes, local volunteers. Far North Queenslanders are incredibly resilient.
The word resilience rang out loud and clear all the way up to and after the cyclone. Same thing happened with the 2019 floods. We were constantly reminded that we Queenslanders are very resilient. Now, sometimes there's talk of a resilient organisation or a resilient community. Sometimes there's talk of a resilient state, like the state of Queensland being resilient. And in disaster recovery and preparedness, approaches taken by national and state government, you can often find resilience being used in this way, to refer to groups or populations. It could also be used to describe infrastructure and buildings. So, ensuring houses are cyclone resilient, for example, or could be used to describe a habitat that's able to survive these extreme events. But the word is increasingly being used to describe the qualities of a person, or rather a characteristic of an archetypal person, the stoic, resilient Queenslander. It's an archetype that has roots in a form of white Australian masculinity that was pronounced during the early period of colonisation of Australia, and it borrowed imagery from the notion of the frontiersman of the early days of the colonisation of the United States. Here is the rugged, independent bushman who can go it alone. His masculinity is forged through his struggle against a harsh and unforgiving land, that type of stuff. Now, this archetype is, unsurprisingly, now being unpicked following the rise of such things as feminism and post-colonial critique. And Australian nationalism and its associated archetypes are slowly being reconstructed. And that's really needed. It's sorely needed because it's an archetype that's based on a series of myths and imaginings that are heavily dosed up with misogyny coming from the past. And it's an archetype that hasn't served us well at all. First off, we aren't all men. And even those of us who aren't all rugged and chiseled from granite. Me being a case in point. Second, not everyone who lives in Queensland is a Queenslander. Again, me being a case in point. We've got lots of migrants like me who live here. We also have lots of tourists, students on visas, temporary workers and so on. Not everyone here comes from here. But we also have First Nations people who have a very different cultural system, which is separate from and at times antagonistic to Australian white mainstream culture. And those nationalistic ideas that inform the archetype of the stoic, resilient Queenslander don't fit them. But no one really fits the archetype because it's an archetype. It's constructed on myths and imaginings. And when the archetype doesn't fit you, as it doesn't, because it doesn't normally fit anyone very well, but when it doesn't fit you and you find the archetype in how stories are told, well, then you kind of get storied out of things. So when you watch the news and they talk about the incoming cyclone and someone says, well, Queenslanders are resilient, we'll be okay, they're, do that thing, they're employing that archetype. And if you don't fit that archetype, there's no recognition of what you're facing. This is less of a problem when people talk about a resilient community. In many ways, that's a comfort, knowing the community will stand strong. So if you don't, it will. But when resilience is talked about as an individual attribute, it could cause you some concern. What if you aren't resilient and you don't cope? Are you the only one? Are you the weak link? Will anyone even notice if you struggle? That's how resilience becomes quite a dangerous concept when it's talked about as an individual attribute that everyone is assumed to have, particularly during events like cyclones, or at least they should have. They should have it. You should be resilient. And this is why psychology is letting us down. It's letting us down because this individual concept of resilience has come from psychology. You know, the concept of resilience has been appropriated by psychology, specifically positive psychology, to refer to a characteristic of an individual that can be measured through psychometrics and improved through psychotherapeutics, most commonly cognitive behavioral therapy. You know, resilience in positive psychology refers to this so-called ability to cope with whatever life throws at you. Some people are knocked down by challenges, but they return as a stronger person, more steadfast than before, because they have resilience. It's what sits behind that tired old cliche, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. You know, no, it doesn't. It doesn't. I get weaker. Anyway, okay, you get my point. Now, ultimately, because psychology says that it's a thing that can be learned, basically positive psychology says this thing called resilience is a thing you can learn. You can get it through psychotherapeutic interventions. You can learn to bounce back when you've gone through hard times. It's seen as somewhat the responsibility of the individual to build up their personal resilience so that they can cope with things like cyclones. If they get knocked down and don't bounce back up, it's because there's something wrong with them. And here, the fix is to fix the person. Two problems with that. First, there are a lot of us who aren't resilient, so there's a lot of people who need fixing. And the second is it relies on the benevolence of the fixer and their judgment that a particular individual is worth fixing. And this is where I think many critical psychologists like me, have a problem with what psychology and specifically positive psychology is doing in this place. Because positive psychology has pulled things in the wrong direction, such that, you know, this is at the very time that when people are losing that sense of all being in it together because of the growing impact of social inequalities. And when this is exacerbated by such events as like cyclones, whose effects are erratic and non-uniform, people struggle to see how others are going through what they're going through. And we have psychology coming in, further making that possibility of people uniting less likely by getting people to disappear into their own heads and ruminate on a project of self-improvement that they may need to get into. And on top of all of that, we've got this knowledge system that offers us up simplistic explanations of these complex events. It encourages us to see the connection between people and places as instrumental rather than symbiotic, and hooks us all into projections of possibilities of things that are actually far from certain and hard to predict. The one thing we had to hold us all together was storytelling. But with the likes of psychology, particularly positive psychology, seeding our stories with constructs like individual resilience, we're all in danger of being robbed of that too. Okay, on that positive note, I'd love to hear what you think about all of this. Let me know by adding your comments below. And remember, if you want to help out with my channel, hit the subscribe button. Okay, that's all for now. Thanks. Ta-da.